Hello. Welcome to Sleepless Veteran. If you're here to rest, to let your mind settle while learning something quietly, you've found the right place. We tell military history slowly, without urgency, without drama, just facts unfolding at a pace that lets you breathe, that lets you process, that lets you drift if you need to. Tonight, we're going to Moscow, to the winter of 1941 and 1942, to the frozen ground outside the Soviet capital, to one of the most catastrophic defeats in military history. But we're not going to tell the story of battles, not the story of grand strategy, not the story of generals and their decisions. Tonight, we're telling a different story, a quieter story, a more terrible story perhaps. We're telling the story of what winter does to an army, what cold does to soldiers, what hunger does to men, what happens when nature becomes the enemy, when temperature becomes weapon, when weather becomes killer. This is the story of the German army in winter 1941 to 42. Outside Moscow, in temperatures that reached -40 degrees, in conditions that no army was prepared for, in cold that killed more than bullets, in hunger that destroyed more than combat. This is story of how 3 million men, who had conquered most of Europe, who had seemed unstoppable, who had advanced hundreds of kilometers into Soviet Union, were stopped, were defeated, were destroyed. Not primarily by Soviet forces, not primarily by Red Army, but by winter, by cold, by starvation, by conditions that made survival impossible, that made combat irrelevant, that killed hundreds of thousands, that broke the Wehrmacht's spirit forever. This is not story with victories, has no triumph, has no glory, is story of suffering, of freezing, of starving, of dying slowly, of army that reached within sight of Moscow, that could see the Kremlin spires, that came so close, but that was stopped. Not by walls, not by defenses, not by soldiers, but by winter, by temperature, by cold that was -40 degrees, by conditions that human body cannot endure, that made soldiers into corpses, that made divisions into graveyards, that made army into collection of frozen, starving, dying men. The story we tell tonight is about numbers. About 227,000 frostbite casualties, about 14,000 amputations, about 33,000 deaths from cold, about 734,000 total casualties in 5 months, about temperatures that were coldest of 20th century, about supply lines that collapsed, about food that didn't arrive, about winter clothing that didn't exist, about army that was prepared for summer campaign, that got winter war, that was destroyed by conditions, by weather, by nature itself. December 5th, 1941. Night. Outside Moscow, the temperature was -35 degrees Celsius, was -31 degrees Fahrenheit, was cold beyond what most humans experience, was cold that killed, that froze, that destroyed. The German soldiers who were dug in, who were holding positions, who were waiting for dawn, for orders, for something, were freezing, were dying slowly, were enduring cold that human body cannot withstand for long, that no preparation could prevent completely, that killed regardless of will, of determination, of training. This was the night before everything changed, the last night of German offensive toward Moscow, the night before Soviet counterattack, the night that would be remembered by survivors as the longest, the coldest, the most terrible of their lives. The positions were shallow trenches dug into frozen earth, were inadequate dugouts carved from ground that resisted every attempt to penetrate it, were holes scraped with tools that broke on frozen soil. The ground was frozen solid to depth that made proper entrenchment nearly impossible, was rock hard, was impenetrable. The soldiers who had tried to dig proper defenses, who had attempted to create shelter, who had used picks and shovels in desperation, had managed only shallow scrapes in the earth, only inadequate holes that provided minimal protection, only trenches that were barely depressions in frozen ground. The positions that were supposed to be defensive lines were really just places where men waited, where they huddled against wind, where they froze slowly, where they died quietly. The positions that couldn't protect against artillery, that couldn't protect against cold, that couldn't protect against anything really, were just places to be, to wait, to freeze, to die. The soldiers were wearing summer uniforms, were not dressed for winter, were not prepared for cold, were not equipped for temperatures of -35. The uniforms that were standard German military issue, that were designed for moderate European climate. That had served well in France in 1940, in Poland in 1939, in Belgium, in everywhere that German army had conquered, were utterly inadequate for Russian winter, for temperatures that dropped below -30, for conditions that killed. The uniforms that were thin, that were not insulated properly, that provided almost no real protection against extreme cold, against wind that cut through fabric like it wasn't there, against temperatures that froze flesh through layers of cloth. The uniforms that were all soldiers had, that were only protection they possessed, against cold that would kill them, that was killing them, that killed many during that night, during every night, during every moment of exposure to Russian winter. The soldiers tried desperately to stay warm, tried everything they could think of, wore layers of whatever they could find, newspaper stuffed between uniform and body, straw packed into jackets, tablecloths taken from abandoned houses, towels wrapped around bodies, anything, everything that might create insulation, that might trap heat, that might keep them alive. The improvised protection that was desperate, that was pathetic, that was evidence of catastrophe. That didn't work. That couldn't work against cold of -35, against Russian winter in full fury, against conditions that killed regardless of improvisation. The soldiers who looked like clowns, who wore ridiculous layers of mismatched materials, who were called winter fritzes by Soviet press, who were mocked in Soviet propaganda, but who were just trying to survive, to not freeze, to live through the night, to see dawn, the improvisation that showed desperation, that revealed unpreparedness, that was evidence of planning failure, of catastrophe that leadership had created, that soldiers endured, that killed them anyway. The weapons didn't work, were frozen solid, the rifles that wouldn't fire because bolts wouldn't move, the machine guns that were seized by ice, the artillery pieces that couldn't elevate or traverse, the weapons that had become useless metal, not because of damage, not because of lack of ammunition, but because of cold, because lubricants had frozen, because oil had turned to thick paste, because moving parts wouldn't move, because -35 degrees froze everything, made everything stop, made weapons into sculptures, into useless weight, into reminders of helplessness. The weapons that soldiers carried, that they cleaned obsessively, that they tried to keep functional, that wouldn't work, that couldn't work in extreme cold, that left soldiers defenseless, unable to fight, unable to resist, unable to defend themselves if attack came. The weapons that were primary tools of warfare, that were what soldiers relied on, that were useless because of cold, because of temperature, because of winter. The vehicles were frozen, wouldn't start, couldn't move. The tanks that were immobile, the panzers that had spearheaded advance across Soviet Union, that had seemed unstoppable in summer, were frozen solid in winter. The engines that wouldn't turn over, the fuel that had gelled in tanks, that was too thick to flow, too viscous to burn. The batteries that were dead, frozen, providing no power. The tanks that just sat, immobile, useless, just metal boxes that provided some shelter from wind, but that couldn't move, couldn't fight, couldn't do what tanks were designed to do. The trucks that were critical for supply, that were supposed to bring food, ammunition, everything army needed, were frozen, wouldn't start, were scattered across landscape, abandoned, useless. The vehicles that required fires built under them just to warm engines enough to maybe start. The dangerous fires that sometimes worked, that often didn't, that sometimes destroyed what they were meant to save. The reversion from mechanized warfare to something more primitive, more desperate, more medieval almost. The horses were dying, were freezing where they stood, were found in morning frozen solid. The horses that pulled supply wagons, that moved artillery, that were transportation when vehicles failed, that were critical to army function, were dying from cold, from lack of food, from conditions they couldn't survive. The horses that stood in lines, that froze overnight, that were rigid corpses by dawn. The loss of horses that was loss of mobility, was loss of supply capability, was loss of artillery movement, was catastrophic for army that already couldn't move properly, that already couldn't supply itself, that already couldn't function as modern military force. The horses that died by hundreds, by thousands, from cold, from starvation, from exposure, from winter that killed animals as effectively as it killed men. The supplies weren't arriving, the supply lines were broken, were cut, were inadequate for distance, for conditions, for reality of situation. The distance from Germany was 2,000 kilometers, was vast, was farther than any previous campaign. The supply lines that had to cover this distance, that had to maintain flow of everything, of food, of ammunition, of fuel, of medicine, of winter clothing that had been ordered, that existed somewhere, that was in warehouses in Germany, but that couldn't reach front, couldn't reach soldiers who needed it, because of distance, because of autumn mud that had frozen into impossible terrain, because of broken railways, because of inadequate transportation, because of everything, the supplies that didn't arrive. That left soldiers without food, without winter clothing, without what they needed to survive, to function, to live. The soldiers were hungry, were starving slowly, the rations that were inadequate, that were irregular, that sometimes didn't arrive at all. The food that was prioritized lower than ammunition, lower than fuel, lower than military necessities. But that was necessity for survival, for maintaining body heat, for living. The soldiers who were fighting, who were freezing, who needed 3,000 calories daily or more to maintain body temperature, to survive extreme cold, to function, weren't getting enough, weren't getting anywhere near adequate nutrition, were receiving perhaps 1,000 calories, perhaps less, were losing weight, were weakening, were starving slowly while freezing quickly, while trying to fight, while enduring conditions that required maximum nutrition, that demanded food, that needed calories to generate heat, to survive, the hunger that combined with cold, that made cold deadlier, that made survival less likely, that killed through combination, through synergy, through hunger making soldiers vulnerable to cold, cold making hunger more deadly, the combination that killed thousands, that weakened everyone, that destroyed army as effectively as combat. The frostbite was universal, was everywhere, was affecting everyone. The fingers that were numb, that couldn't feel, that couldn't grip properly, the toes that were frozen, that were turning black, that were dying tissue, the ears that were damaged, that were frostbitten, that were permanent casualties, the noses that froze, the faces that were damaged, the extremities that were dying from exposure, from cold, from temperatures that killed tissue, that froze flesh, that destroyed, the frostbite that was epidemic, that was overwhelming medical services, that was affecting thousands, tens of thousands, that was creating casualties faster than combat, that was destroying army more effectively than Soviet guns, That would require amputations, thousands of amputations. That would disable soldiers permanently. That would remove them from combat capability forever. The frostbite that was product of cold, of inadequate protection, of exposure, of conditions that human tissue cannot survive, that human body cannot endure, that killed, that destroyed. That was everywhere, on everyone, during that night, during every night, during winter outside Moscow. The morale was breaking, was crumbling, was deteriorating day by day. The soldiers who had been confident, who had been victorious, who had conquered France, Poland, the Balkans, who had seemed unstoppable through summer and autumn, were demoralized, were frightened, were understanding slowly that they might not win, that they might not survive, that cold might kill them, that winter might defeat them, that victory was impossible. The realization that was spreading, that was growing, that was destroying confidence that had carried them across Europe. The understanding that was terrible, that was demoralizing, that was worse than physical suffering perhaps, that they were losing, not to enemy forces primarily, but to weather, not to combat, but to cold, not to Soviet soldiers, but to winter, to nature, to conditions they couldn't fight, couldn't defeat, couldn't overcome. The demoralization that was spreading through army, that was visible in eyes, in voices, in behavior. That was breaking spirit as surely as cold was breaking bodies. The night of December 5th was last night of offensive, was last night of advance, was last night of German army trying to capture Moscow, was last night before everything changed, before Soviet counterattack, before retreat began, before world understood clearly that German advance had been stopped, that Wehrmacht had been defeated, that army had been broken by winter, by cold, by conditions. That made victory impossible. The night that soldiers endured in inadequate positions, in summer uniforms, with frozen weapons, with dying horses, with broken supply lines, with spreading frostbite, with collapsing morale, with hunger, with cold, with suffering that tested limits of human endurance. The night before dawn of December 6th, when Soviet forces would attack, when retreat would begin, when German defeat would become undeniable. The night, that was last moment, of German offensive, that had come so close, that had reached within sight of Moscow, that had seemed capable of achieving objective, but that was ending, not in triumph, but in frozen trenches, in starving soldiers, in dying men, in cold of -35 degrees. The moment before dawn, before everything changed, before winter completed its work of breaking German army forever. June 22nd, 1941. Operation Barbarossa began, the invasion of Soviet Union, the largest military operation in human history. 3 million German soldiers, supported by another 1 million from Romania, Hungary, Italy, and other Axis partners, advanced across border into Soviet territory. The operation that Hitler believed would end war in East within weeks, would destroy Soviet Union completely, would secure living space for Germany, would achieve final victory, quickly, decisively, completely, before autumn, certainly before winter. The operation that was planned with confidence, with certainty, with absolute belief in quick victory. The planning that assumed campaign would last 6 to 8 weeks, that Soviet Union would collapse like France had collapsed, that Red Army would disintegrate rapidly, that resistance would crumble within weeks. The assumption that was fundamental, that shaped everything, that determined all planning, that made winter preparation unnecessary, that made extended logistics irrelevant, that created catastrophe. The planning was based on multiple assumptions about Soviet weakness, on intelligence assessments that proved wildly wrong, on beliefs that were comfortable but false. The German intelligence had assessed Soviet Union as weak, as poorly led, as ready to collapse. The assessments that were based on Soviet performance in Finland. On Winter War of 1939-40, when Soviet forces had struggled against Finnish defenders, had suffered enormous casualties, had eventually won but had looked incompetent doing it. The performance that German intelligence used to assess Soviet military capability, to predict Soviet collapse. The assessments that also considered Stalin's purges. The execution of thousands of Soviet officers in 1937 and 38. The purges that had decapitated Soviet officer corps, that had removed experienced commanders, that had created leadership vacuum that German intelligence believed, made Soviet military incompetent, incapable, ready to collapse. The intelligence assessments that were wrong, that underestimated Soviet strength, that misjudged Soviet capability, that predicted collapse that wouldn't come, that was foundation of disastrous planning. The quick victory assumption shaped all logistics, all preparation, all planning. The assumption that campaign would end before winter made winter clothing unnecessary, made extended supply lines irrelevant, made preparation for prolonged operations pointless. The planning that was based on 6 to 8 week campaign, that calculated supplies for short operation, that didn't consider possibility of extended combat, of winter warfare, of prolonged struggle, the planning that was adequate for quick victory, but catastrophic for reality, for campaign that continued, for fighting that lasted, into autumn, into winter, into conditions that planning hadn't considered, hadn't prepared for, hadn't imagined. The winter clothing existed, had been ordered, had been manufactured, was sitting in warehouses in Germany, but only for 60 divisions, the divisions that would remain for occupation duty after victory, after Soviet Union collapsed, after campaign ended, the 60 divisions out of 150 divisions total, that would need winter clothing for occupation after everyone else went home, after campaign ended. Before winter came, the calculation that was logical. If campaign ended quickly, if victory came before winter, if assumptions were correct, the winter clothing for 60 divisions, not for entire army, not for everyone, because everyone else would be back in Germany, would have won, would be finished before winter arrived. The winter clothing that existed, that was ready, that wouldn't reach those who needed it, because planning assumed they wouldn't need it, would be gone. Before winter came, the summer uniforms were standard issue for entire invasion force, were what 3 million soldiers wore, were what they had, were only clothing they possessed. The uniforms that were adequate for summer campaign, that worked fine in moderate temperatures, that were designed for European warfare, for France, for Poland, for normal military operations, were completely inadequate for Russian winter, for temperatures that dropped below -30, for conditions that would kill, that would freeze, that would destroy. The uniforms that soldiers would still be wearing when December came, when January came, when temperatures dropped to -40, because planning assumed they would be gone by then, would have won by then, would be back in Germany by then, the uniforms that were death sentences, when campaign didn't end, when winter came, when soldiers were still there, still fighting, still freezing, in summer uniforms. That provided no protection against Russian winter. The supply priorities reflected offensive assumptions, were calculated for rapid advance, for breakthrough operations, for quick victory. The ammunition that was stockpiled, in quantities needed for intensive combat, the fuel that was accumulated, for tanks, for vehicles, for rapid advance, the supplies that were prioritized for offensive, for attack, for achieving victory, the food that was calculated for sustaining soldiers during short campaign, not for extended operations, not for winter warfare, not for prolonged struggle, the medical supplies that were adequate for normal casualty rates, not for winter casualties, not for frostbite epidemic, not for catastrophe. The supply priorities that made sense, for quick campaign, but that were inadequate, for reality, for extended operations, for winter warfare that would occur. The logistics were stretched from beginning of campaign. The distance from German border to Moscow was over 1,000 kilometers. Was vast distance, was farther than campaigns in Poland or France. The supply lines that had to cover this distance, that had to maintain flow of everything, to advancing army, that was spreading across wide front, that was moving away from supply bases daily. The logistics that were difficult from start, that were challenged by distance, by terrain, by everything. That worked initially, during rapid advance, during summer, when conditions were favorable. But that would break. When autumn came, when mud season arrived, when Rasputitsa turned roads to rivers, when winter froze everything, when conditions made supply nearly impossible. The logistics that were adequate for short campaign, that were inadequate for extended operations, that would fail catastrophically. When campaign continued, beyond planning assumptions, beyond preparation, beyond capability, the confidence was extraordinarily high throughout German command, was based on previous successes, on rapid victories in Poland, in France, in Yugoslavia, in Greece, on Wehrmacht's apparent invincibility, on speed of advance, on destruction of Soviet forces in early battles. The confidence that seemed justified by initial successes, by massive encirclements, by hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners, by rapid advance toward Moscow. The confidence that led to complacency, that prevented proper planning, that dismissed warnings, that assumed best case, that believed in inevitable victory, that ignored possibilities of problems, of delays, of setbacks. The confidence that was enemy, that was catastrophic, that led to planning failures, that created disaster, that contributed to catastrophe. The warnings were given by some officers, by some planners, who knew Russia, who had studied Napoleon's campaign, who understood logistics, who saw distance, who recognized challenges, who warned that campaign might not end quickly, that winter might arrive before victory, that preparations should be made for possibility of winter warfare. The warnings that existed, that were documented, that were presented to leadership, but that were dismissed, were ignored, were rejected by Hitler, who believed in quick victory, who wouldn't consider possibility of failure, who dismissed concerns as defeatism, by staff who shared confidence, who believed warnings were unnecessary, who thought preparations were pointless, because victory would come quickly, before winter, before problems, before warnings became reality. The warnings that were ignored, that were proven correct, that were tragic in their accuracy, in their prescience, in their complete futility. The promise was explicit, was clear, was foundation of entire operation. Quick victory, before winter, campaign over by autumn. Soviet Union destroyed within weeks. War in East won rapidly. The promise that determined everything, that shaped all planning, that made winter preparations unnecessary, that made extended logistics irrelevant, that made campaign possible, but that made catastrophe inevitable. When promise was broken, when assumptions were wrong, when campaign continued, when winter came, when soldiers were still there, still fighting, still dying, in summer uniforms, without supplies, without preparation, because of promise. That was false, that was based on assumptions, that were wrong, that created catastrophe, the promise of quick victory, that condemned German army, that killed hundreds of thousands, that broke Wehrmacht forever, the promise that was foundation of Operation Barbarossa, that was also foundation of catastrophe, that would destroy German army, outside Moscow, in winter of 1941, to 42, October 1941. The autumn rains began. The Rasputitsa arrived. The season of mud. That occurs twice yearly in European Russia. In spring when snow melts. In autumn when rains fall. When ground becomes saturated. When entire landscape transforms into impassable swamp. When roads disappear under mud. When fields become quagmires. When movement becomes nearly impossible. The Rasputitsa that German planners knew about. That they had studied. That they had read about in accounts of Napoleon's campaign, that they had hoped to avoid, by ending campaign before autumn, by achieving victory before rains came, by conquering Soviet Union before mud season began, but that they didn't avoid. Because campaign didn't end. Because advance continued, because army was still fighting, still advancing, still trying to reach Moscow. When October came, when rains began, when mud season started, when everything became harder. Slower, more difficult, more impossible. The mud was total, was complete, was everywhere. The rains that fell continuously throughout October, that turned roads into rivers of mud, that made fields into swamps, that created conditions that are difficult to imagine, difficult to describe, difficult to comprehend. Unless experienced, the mud that was chest deep in places, that swallowed vehicles, that trapped soldiers, that made movement torture, that stopped advance more effectively than Soviet defenses. The mud that wasn't just inconvenience, wasn't just difficulty, was catastrophe, was tactical defeat, was strategic disaster, that stopped German army more completely than Red Army could. That created crisis. That delayed advance. That gave Soviet forces time to prepare, to strengthen defenses, to organize for Battle of Moscow. The mud that was enemy as effective as Soviet divisions, as deadly as Soviet guns, as catastrophic as Soviet resistance. The tanks got stuck in mud regularly, the panzers that had spearheaded advance across Soviet Union. That had broken through Soviet lines repeatedly. That had created massive encirclements. That had seemed unstoppable through summer. Got stuck in autumn mud, couldn't move, couldn't advance, couldn't maneuver. The tanks that sank into mud, that became trapped, that required hours to extract. Sometimes days, sometimes had to be abandoned. The panzers that were pride of Wehrmacht, that were breakthrough force, that were supposed to lead advance to Moscow, were neutralized by mud, were stopped by Rasputitsa, were rendered useless by conditions, not by Soviet anti-tank guns, not by combat, but by mud, by weather, by nature. The tanks stuck in mud. That showed how weather was defeating German army. Before winter even arrived, before cold became factor, just mud, just rain, just Rasputitsa was enough to stop advance, to halt offensive, to create crisis. The trucks were even worse than tanks in mud. The supply trucks that carried food, that transported ammunition, that moved fuel, that were lifeline of army, got stuck constantly, completely, couldn't move, couldn't deliver supplies, couldn't maintain flow of necessities that army required, that soldiers needed, that operations demanded. The trucks that sank into mud, that became trapped, that had to be dug out laboriously, that sometimes had to be abandoned, that left supplies behind. Unable to reach front, unable to supply advancing forces. The trucks that were critical for logistics, for supply, for everything modern army needs, were neutralized by mud, were stopped by Rasputitsa, were made useless by conditions. The supply failure that began in October, with mud, before winter even arrived. The trucks stuck in mud, that couldn't deliver food, couldn't transport ammunition, couldn't supply army. That was beginning of supply crisis. That would become catastrophic. In winter, when cold added to mud, when everything became impossible, the horses did better than vehicles in mud, could go where trucks couldn't, could pull where vehicles failed. The horses that suddenly became more valuable than tanks, more useful than trucks, more reliable than modern technology. The reversion to older methods, to animal power, to transportation that was centuries old. But that worked in mud. That could keep moving when vehicles couldn't. The horses pulling supply wagons. That became primary method of supply, of transport, of logistics. Not modern mechanized transport, but traditional horse-drawn wagons. That could navigate mud. That could keep army supplied. Somewhat, inadequately, but better than nothing. The dependence on horses. That showed how mud had defeated modern warfare, had neutralized technological advantage, had reduced Wehrmacht to methods that would have been familiar, to Napoleon's army, to 19th century warfare. The horses. That became critical. That became primary. That showed how completely mud had changed. Nature of campaign. The advance slowed dramatically in October. The offensive that had covered hundreds of kilometers in summer, that had advanced rapidly toward Moscow, that had seemed capable of capturing capital, slowed to crawl, then nearly stopped. The divisions that had advanced kilometers daily now measured progress in hundreds of meters, sometimes couldn't advance at all. The offensive toward Moscow, that had been rapid, that had been threatening, that had been close to success, stopped, bogged down, stalled, in mud. Not from Soviet resistance primarily, not from combat, not from Red Army defenses, but from mud, from weather, from Rasputitsa. That made advance impossible. That stopped offensive. That gave Soviet forces time, precious time, critical time, to prepare defenses, to bring up reinforcements, to organize. For defense of Moscow, the advance stopped by mud. In October, that was first defeat, first indication that nature was enemy, that weather could stop Wehrmacht, that German army wasn't invincible, against conditions, against environment, against Russian weather. The soldiers suffered terribly in mud. The infantry that had to march, that had to move through mud, that was chest deep, that pulled at boots, that exhausted men completely. The soldiers who were tired already, who had been fighting since June, who had marched hundreds of kilometers, who had been in continuous combat for months, now faced mud. That made everything harder. That exhausted them completely. That was physical torture. The march through mud, that took hours. To cover kilometers, that left men exhausted, covered in mud, unable to dry, unable to clean, unable to rest properly. The soldiers who developed foot problems, who couldn't keep feet dry, who had trench foot, who suffered from conditions, from mud, from constant wetness, from inability to dry boots, to dry clothing, to be clean, to be comfortable, ever the suffering. In October, mud, that was preview of winter suffering that would come. That was indication of what happened when German army met Russian weather unprepared. The supplies began to fail in October. The supply lines that were stretched already, that covered vast distance, that were difficult to maintain, became nearly impossible in mud. The trucks stuck, the vehicles trapped, the supplies that couldn't move forward, that accumulated behind front, while soldiers at front ran low, on ammunition, on fuel, on food, on everything. The beginning of supply crisis, that would become catastrophic in winter. That started in October, with mud, with Rasputitsa, with conditions that stopped supply trucks. That made logistics nearly impossible. The supplies that didn't reach soldiers, that left them hungry, undersupplied, unable to conduct operations properly, unable to advance effectively, unable to function as modern mechanized army. The supply failure, that began in October. That started with mud. That would continue. That would worsen. That would become catastrophic. In winter, when cold added to problems, when everything became worse. The October mud was warning, was indication, was preview of what was coming. The mud that slowed advance, that stopped offensive temporarily, that created supply problems, was bad, was difficult, was challenge, but was temporary, would end. When ground froze, when temperature dropped, when mud turned to ice, the mud that made October difficult would be replaced by something worse. By cold, by winter, by temperatures that would drop to -40, by conditions that would kill, that would freeze, that would destroy, more completely than mud, more catastrophically than Rasputitsa, more deadly than anything yet experienced. The October mud, that stopped advance, that created problems, that exhausted soldiers, was just beginning of disaster, was first indication that nature was enemy, that weather could defeat Wehrmacht, that conditions could destroy German army. The mud, that was warning, that was preview, that was indication of catastrophe that was coming. When winter arrived, when cold came, when temperature became killer, the October mud, that was bad, but that was nothing. Compared to winter, that would come, that would destroy, that would break. German army, completely. Late November 1941. The ground froze. The mud ended. The advance resumed. For one final push, for last offensive, for desperate attempt to reach Moscow, to capture Soviet capital, to achieve objective, before winter became complete, before cold became lethal, before temperature made operations impossible. The final offensive that was resumed. When mud froze, when ground hardened, when movement was possible again, the offensive that had been stalled in October, that resumed in November. That was Army's last chance, last opportunity, last attempt to salvage campaign, to achieve victory, to reach Moscow before winter killed that possibility. Forever. The German forces pushed forward again when mud froze, advanced toward Moscow through November, got closer to capital day by day, week by week. The offensive that made progress, that covered ground, that approached objective, that brought German forces to very outskirts of Moscow, to positions from which they could see city, could observe target, could see goal. That had driven campaign since June, the advance in November. That was last gasp, was final effort, was desperate attempt, by exhausted army, to achieve objective, before cold made it impossible. The advance that succeeded in getting close, very close, tantalizingly close, to Moscow. But that couldn't complete task, couldn't capture capital, couldn't achieve objective, before winter stopped everything. The forward German elements reached Khimki, suburb of Moscow, located 15 to 20 kilometers from Kremlin, depending on exact positions. The closest German forces ever got to Soviet capital, the suburb. That was within city limits almost. That was so close to objective. The soldiers who reached Khimki, who were closest to Moscow, who could see buildings of capital, who could observe through binoculars the spires of churches, the distinctive architecture, the target they had been fighting toward for months, the view that was tantalizing, that was frustrating, that showed how close they were, how near objective seemed, how achievable goal appeared, for brief moment, for last time. Before winter ended everything, before cold stopped advance, before temperature made further progress impossible, the soldiers could see St. Basil's Cathedral, could see distinctive onion domes, could see famous architecture of Red Square. From forward positions, through optics, through binoculars. The view that was clear on cold days. When air was transparent, when visibility was good. The view of Moscow. That was goal, that was objective, that was what they had been fighting for. Since June, since operation began, since invasion started, the view that showed how close they were, how near victory seemed, how achievable objective appeared. But that also showed how far they were, how impossible final distance seemed, how inadequate their strength was. For completing task, for capturing city, for achieving victory. The view. From Kimki. From 15 kilometers away, that was closest German army ever got. To Moscow, before retreat, before withdrawal, before winter forced them back. But the soldiers who reached Kimki, who saw Moscow, who were closest to objective, were at end of endurance, were exhausted completely, were barely functional as military force. The soldiers who had been fighting continuously since June, who had marched over 1,000 kilometers, who had been in combat for 5 months, without real rest, without adequate supplies, without relief, were exhausted, were depleted, were shadows of soldiers who had invaded. In June, the physical exhaustion, that was total, that was overwhelming, that made further advance nearly impossible. The soldiers who could barely march, who could barely fight, who could barely function, who were at limits of human endurance, who couldn't be pushed further, who couldn't advance more, who couldn't achieve objective. That was 15 kilometers away, but that might as well have been 15,000. Because they didn't have strength, didn't have capability, didn't have anything left to cover final distance. The divisions were shadows of their former strength, were depleted by months of combat, by continuous casualties, by attrition that reduced every unit, dramatically. The divisions that were supposed to number 10,000 men or more, numbered 3,000, 2,000, were reduced to fraction of authorized strength. The battalions that should have been 1,000 men were 200, were shadows, were fragments, were barely capable of functioning. The reduction in strength. That was catastrophic. That was result of 5 months of combat, of casualties that couldn't be replaced, of reinforcements that didn't arrive, of attrition that destroyed units. Slowly, steadily, completely. The divisions at Moscow, that were divisions in name only, that were really reinforced battalions, under-strength regiments, fragments of once powerful force, that had invaded, in June, with confidence, with strength, with capability. That was now gone, depleted, reduced to fraction. The casualties from invasion through November were enormous, were catastrophic, were unsustainable. 734,000 casualties in 5 months of operations, 23% of army strength, of 3.2 million men who had invaded. Over 700,000 were dead, wounded, missing, were casualties. That had depleted divisions, that had weakened army catastrophically, that had reduced combat capability to fraction of what it had been. The casualties that included 200,000 killed, 500,000 wounded, many thousands missing. The casualties that couldn't be replaced adequately, that weren't being replaced because reinforcements weren't arriving, weren't sufficient, weren't enough to maintain strength, to sustain operations, to keep divisions functional. The casualties that were normal for successful offensive operations, that were expected, but that were unsustainable, over time, over months, without adequate replacements, without reinforcements. That would restore strength, that would maintain capability. That never came. The supplies were critically short by November. The supply line stretched across 2,000 kilometers, were barely maintaining minimal flow, were inadequate for army's needs. The ammunition that was running low, the fuel that was nearly exhausted, the food that was insufficient, the medical supplies that were inadequate for casualties, the winter clothing, that existed in Germany, but that wasn't reaching front, that couldn't reach soldiers who needed it desperately. As cold intensified, as temperature dropped, as November brought first real cold, first deadly temperatures, first conditions that killed, the supplies, that should have been arriving, that should have been sustaining army, that weren't. Because supply lines were too long, because transportation was inadequate, because logistics couldn't maintain flow, over distance, over terrain, over conditions. That made supply nearly impossible. The cold was intensifying in late November. The temperature was dropping, was bringing first real cold of winter, first temperatures that killed. That froze, that destroyed. The -10, -15, -20 degrees, that were coming in late November, that were preview of worse to come. In December, in January, when temperatures would drop to -40, but that were already severe enough to cause problems, to create casualties, to show that army wasn't prepared for winter, for cold, for conditions that were coming. The soldiers who still wore summer uniforms, who had no winter clothing, who were feeling first real cold, first deadly temperatures, first preview of winter that would destroy them. The cold in late November, that was beginning of winter catastrophe, that would become total in December, in January, when temperatures dropped further, when cold became lethal, when winter killed hundreds of thousands. The frostbite was beginning to appear in army units, the first cases of frozen tissue, of damaged extremities, of soldiers who couldn't function properly, who had numb fingers, frozen toes, damaged ears, the early frostbite cases that were appearing in late November, that were preview of epidemic, that was coming, of catastrophe, that would overwhelm medical services, that would disable tens of thousands. The frostbite, that was product of cold, of inadequate protection, of summer uniforms, in winter conditions. The frostbite, that was beginning, that would become universal, that would affect everyone, that would create 227,000 casualties. Over winter, the frostbite. That started. In late November, that was warning, that was indication of catastrophe, that was coming. The offensive was dying, was ending, was approaching limit of what exhausted army could achieve. The advance, that had brought forces to Khimki, that had reached 15 kilometers from Moscow, that had come so close to objective, was stopping, was halting, was unable to continue, because soldiers were exhausted, because divisions were depleted, because supplies were inadequate, because cold was intensifying, because everything was wrong, everything was inadequate, everything was failing. The offensive, that had seemed possible. In summer, that had seemed achievable. In autumn, was impossible. In November, was beyond capability of exhausted, depleted, freezing, starving army. That had reached as far as it could, that couldn't go further, that couldn't achieve objective, that was 15 kilometers away, but unreachable. The offensive, that stopped at gates of Moscow, within sight of Kremlin spires, unable to advance, unable to capture capital, unable to achieve what had been goal. Since June, the offensive, that failed at Moscow, that showed that army was finished, was exhausted, was defeated, not primarily by Red Army, but by distance, by attrition, by logistics, by cold, by everything that had accumulated over 5 months to create defeat at Moscow. The offensive, that came so close, that reached so far, but that failed, that stopped, that ended at Khimki, 15 kilometers from victory, but unable to achieve it, the moment of closest approach. That was also moment of failure, of defeat, of understanding. That campaign was lost, that objective wouldn't be achieved, that Moscow wouldn't fall, that army was broken, not by combat primarily, but by conditions, by weather, by winter. That was coming, that would complete. Destruction, that had begun. Early December 1941. The temperature dropped. Suddenly, dramatically, catastrophically. The cold that had been increasing gradually through November, intensified rapidly in early December, dropped from -10 to -30 to -40 in matter of days. The temperature plunge. That was sudden. That was extreme. That was unprecedented. That created immediate crisis. For German army, that was unprepared. That was unprotected. That was vulnerable. To cold. That would kill. The winter of 1941 to 42. That was coldest European winter of 20th century. The temperature records that showed this was exceptional cold, was extreme winter, was weather that broke records. Even for Russia, even for Moscow region, that had cold winters normally. But this winter was extraordinary, was exceptional, was extreme, was coldest on record. The temperature reports from German units varied by location, by timing, by measurement method, but all agreed on extreme cold, on unprecedented temperatures, on conditions that killed. Field Marshal von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, reported to Berlin on November 30th, temperature of -45 degrees Celsius, -49 degrees Fahrenheit. The report that showed how cold it was, how extreme conditions were. General Erhard Raus, commander of 6th Panzer Division, kept war diary, recorded daily temperatures, showed sudden cold period. December 4th through 7th, temperatures of -36 to -38 degrees Celsius, -33 to -36 degrees Fahrenheit. The daily recordings that documented extreme cold that showed how temperature stayed deadly day after day. The official Soviet meteorological records showed lowest December temperature of -28.8 degrees Celsius, -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The variation in reports from different sources, but consistency in message was extreme cold, was unprecedented conditions, was temperatures that killed. The cold hit suddenly, without gradual transition, without warning really. The temperature that had been -10 to -15 dropped to -30 to -40 in matter of days. Early December, the sudden plunge. That caught army, completely unprepared, totally vulnerable, absolutely exposed. The soldiers who were still in summer uniforms, who had minimal protection, who were suddenly facing cold that was deadly. Immediately, the sudden drop. That created instant crisis. That began killing. Immediately. That overwhelmed everything, everyone. The sudden cold. That was like attack, like offensive, like bombardment. That struck entire army. Simultaneously. That created casualties. Instantly. That began killing. Before soldiers could adapt, could prepare, could do anything to protect themselves. The sudden cold of early December. That was tactical weapon. That was strategic catastrophe. That was beginning of destruction. That would kill hundreds of thousands over winter. The weapons froze solid. Immediately. When extreme cold hit, the rifles that wouldn't fire because bolts wouldn't move, because mechanisms were frozen, because lubricants had turned to ice. The machine guns that were seized, that were useless, that couldn't fire, because operating mechanisms were frozen solid. The artillery that couldn't elevate, couldn't traverse, couldn't fire, because hydraulic systems were frozen, because mechanisms were seized, because everything was ice. The weapons that were primary tools of warfare, of soldiers, were rendered completely useless, not from damage, not from enemy action, but from cold, from temperature, from -40 degrees. That froze. Everything. The weapons that wouldn't work, couldn't work in extreme cold. The soldiers who were defenseless, who couldn't fight, who couldn't resist. Because weapons were frozen solid, were useless, were just weight to carry. The weapons failure. That was complete. That was total. That showed how unprepared Army was. For winter warfare, for extreme cold, for temperatures. That made everything. Stop working. The vehicles stopped working. All vehicles. Simultaneously. Completely. The tanks that were immobile. That wouldn't start. That couldn't move. The panzers that had spearheaded advance, that had been pride of Wehrmacht, were frozen solid. The engines that wouldn't turn over, that wouldn't start, that were seized. The fuel that had gelled, that was too thick to flow. Through fuel lines, through injectors, through system, the fuel that wouldn't burn, wouldn't combust, wouldn't function. At -40, the batteries that were dead, that were frozen, that provided no electrical power, nothing. The tanks that just sat, immobile. Useless, just metal boxes, that provided some shelter from wind, but that couldn't move, couldn't fight, couldn't do what tanks were designed for. The immobility, that was catastrophic, that eliminated mobile warfare, that reduced tanks to pillboxes, to stationary guns, if guns worked, which they often didn't. The tanks that were frozen, that were useless, that were evidence of complete failure of preparation for winter. The trucks suffered same fate as tanks, the supply trucks, that were critical. For logistics, for supply, for everything. Stopped working, wouldn't start. Were frozen. The engines that were seized, the fuel that was gelled, the batteries that were dead, the trucks that couldn't deliver supplies, couldn't transport food, couldn't move ammunition, couldn't function, the trucks that sometimes required fires built under them to warm engines, to thin fuel, to make starting possible, the fires that were dangerous, that sometimes destroyed what they were meant to save, that sometimes worked but often didn't. The reversion from mechanized transport to older methods, to horse-drawn wagons, to animal power, to transportation. That was centuries old, but that worked better than frozen vehicles. The trucks that were useless, that showed how completely cold had neutralized German technological advantage, had reduced Wehrmacht to methods that would have been familiar to Napoleon's army. The horses died by thousands, from cold, from exposure, from temperatures. They couldn't survive. The horses that had become critical after vehicles failed, that were primary transportation, primary supply method, primary everything, were dying from cold, were being found in mourning, frozen where they stood, rigid corpses that had been living horses. Night before, the horses that were critical resource, critical capability, critical for army function, were dying from temperatures that killed them as surely as killed men. The loss of horses, that was catastrophic, was loss of mobility, was loss of supply capability, was loss of everything. That had worked. When vehicles failed, the horses that died by hundreds, daily, that reduced army capability. Further, that made supply even more impossible. That eliminated last functioning transportation method, the dying horses that were evidence of how completely cold destroyed everything, everyone that was exposed to extreme temperatures, to Russian winter. The frostbite exploded, became epidemic, became universal, almost overnight, when extreme cold hit. The frostbite cases that had been beginning in late November became thousands, tens of thousands in early December. The soldiers who were exposed to -40 temperatures in summer uniforms with inadequate protection developed frostbite. Universally, everyone had some degree of frozen tissue, of damaged extremities, of frostbite. The fingers that froze, that turned white, then blue, then black. the toes that froze, in inadequate boots that weren't insulated, that didn't protect, against extreme cold, the ears that froze, that were permanently damaged, the noses that froze, the faces that were frostbitten, the extremities that were dying from exposure to cold, that human tissue cannot survive, cannot withstand, cannot endure, the frostbite, that was universal, that affected everyone, that created casualties by thousands, daily, that overwhelmed medical services completely. By end of November, medical services reported more frostbite cases than combat wounds. The milestone that was shocking, that was unprecedented, that showed how completely cold had become primary enemy, primary creator of casualties, primary destroyer of army. The statistic that frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties was extraordinary, was evidence of catastrophe. The soldiers who were being disabled by weather faster than by combat, who were casualties of cold more than of enemy action, the frostbite that exceeded combat wounds in casualties created, was evidence that cold was deadlier than bullets, that winter was destroying army more effectively than Red Army, that nature had become ultimate weapon against German army outside Moscow. The soldiers tried desperately to protect themselves, to stay warm, to survive, tried everything they could think of, wore newspaper stuffed between uniform and skin, wore straw packed into jackets, wore tablecloths taken from abandoned houses, wore towels wrapped around bodies, wore anything, everything that might provide insulation, that might trap heat, that might keep them alive. The improvised protection that was desperate, that was necessary, that was pathetic, that was evidence of complete failure, of preparation. The soldiers who wore ridiculous layers, who looked like clowns, who were mocked as winter fritzes by Soviet propaganda, but who were just trying to survive, trying not to freeze, trying to live through cold that was killing them. The improvisation that showed desperation, that revealed complete lack of proper equipment, that was evidence of catastrophe. The improvisation that didn't work, that couldn't work, against cold of -40, against Russian winter in full fury, against temperatures that killed. Regardless of improvisation, of effort, of desperation, the morale began to break. In early December, when cold hit, when soldiers understood what they faced, when reality of situation became clear, the soldiers who had been confident, who had conquered Europe, who had seemed invincible, began to break psychologically, began to understand that they might not survive, that cold might kill them, that winter might defeat them, that victory was impossible. The realization that was terrible, that was demoralizing, that spread through army, that destroyed what combat hadn't, the confidence, the belief, the certainty that had carried them across Europe, the morale that began breaking when cold hit, when winter showed its power, its deadliness, its capacity to destroy German army, the psychological defeat that accompanied physical defeat that was product of cold, of hunger, of suffering, of understanding that they were losing to weather, to nature, to conditions they couldn't fight, couldn't defeat, couldn't overcome. The cold of early December was beginning of catastrophe, was moment when weather became primary enemy, when temperature became primary killer, when nature began destroying German army more effectively than combat, than Red Army, than anything. The cold that hit suddenly, that dropped to -40, that froze weapons, that stopped vehicles, that killed horses, that created Frostbite Epidemic, that began destroying army, soldier by soldier, unit by unit, day by day. The cold, that would continue through December, through January, through February, until army was broken completely. The cold of early December, that was beginning of end, of destruction, of catastrophe. That would kill hundreds of thousands, that would break German army forever. The moment when cold became enemy, when winter became weapon, when temperature became killer, that destroyed Wehrmacht outside Moscow. The medical services were overwhelmed within days of extreme cold arriving, were flooded with casualties, were unable to cope with thousands of frostbite cases that arrived daily, that needed treatment immediately, that required care urgently. The field hospitals that had been established behind German lines, that were designed to treat combat casualties, to handle wounded from battle, were suddenly receiving different casualties, frostbite victims by thousands, who needed different treatment, different care, different everything. The hospitals that weren't prepared for frostbite epidemic, for casualties, from cold, for medical crisis. That was unprecedented. The medical services that were trained for combat casualties, for gunshot wounds, for shrapnel injuries, for battlefield trauma, not for frostbite, not for cold injuries, not for epidemic, of frozen tissue, the overwhelmed medical services that couldn't cope with volume, with types of injuries, with scale of catastrophe. That cold had created the frostbite casualties over winter, totaled 227,512, the official figure, from German medical records, the documented cases that were processed through medical system, that were treated by military medical services, that were recorded in official statistics. The 227,000 who had frozen tissue, who had frostbite, who required medical attention, who needed treatment, who sometimes needed surgery, who sometimes needed amputation. The number, that was staggering, that was unprecedented in military medical history, that exceeded combat casualties from same period, that showed how completely cold had become primary enemy, primary creator of casualties. The 227,000 frostbite cases, that documented catastrophe, that showed scale of disaster, that proved that winter was deadliest enemy Wehrmacht faced outside Moscow. The frostbite occurred in degrees, in stages of severity. The first degree frostbite was least severe, was superficial, affected outer layers of skin tissue only, created numbness, created pain, created swelling, but didn't kill tissue completely, was recoverable with treatment, with warmth, with care. The first degree, that was most common, that affected almost everyone, that reduced function, that made soldiers less effective, that diminished combat capability without removing soldiers from duty, just making them less capable, less effective, less dangerous. The first degree frostbite, that was universal, that affected every soldier who was exposed to extreme cold in inadequate protection, that reduced effectiveness of entire army by making everyone slightly less functional, slightly less capable, slightly less effective. The cumulative effect, that was enormous. That degraded entire armies' combat capability significantly. The second degree frostbite was more severe, was deeper. Killed some tissue, created blisters, created more serious damage, required longer recovery, but usually didn't require amputation, could heal with proper treatment, with time, with care. The second degree, that affected tens of thousands. That was serious, that was disabling. Temporarily, that removed soldiers from combat, for weeks, sometimes months. That created significant casualties that reduced combat strength of divisions significantly. The second-degree frostbite, that was product of longer exposure, of more severe cold, of less adequate protection, that disabled soldiers temporarily. That created medical crisis, that filled hospitals, that overwhelmed treatment capability. The second degree, that was epidemic, that affected tens of thousands, that showed how severe frostbite problem had become. The third-degree frostbite was most severe, was deadly, to tissue, killed tissue, completely, created gangrene, created black tissue. That was dead, that was rotting, that smelled of death, of decay, that had to be removed, to save life, to prevent infection from spreading, to stop gangrene from killing patient. The third-degree frostbite, that required amputation, required surgery, required removal of dead tissue, of frozen extremities, of everything that had died. From cold, the third degree, that affected thousands, that created most serious medical emergency, that required surgical intervention, that needed amputation, that disabled permanently German soldiers, that removed them from military service forever. The third-degree frostbite, that was catastrophic for individuals who lost fingers, toes, feet, hands, arms, legs, who were maimed permanently by cold, by winter, by frostbite. The amputations numbered 14,000 to 20,000. Documented cases of amputation required by severe frostbite, the surgical removal of frozen tissue, of dead extremities, of gangrenous limbs that had to be removed to save lives, to prevent death from infection, from gangrene, from sepsis. The amputations that were performed in field hospitals under primitive conditions, with inadequate supplies, with limited anesthesia, with everything working against successful outcome. The fingers that were amputated by thousands. The smallest amputations, most common, that disabled soldiers' ability to grip, to hold, to function. The toes that were amputated by tens of thousands, that affected ability to walk, to march, to move. The feet that were amputated by hundreds. The major amputations that disabled completely, that ended military service permanently. The hands that were removed, the arms that were amputated, the legs that were removed, the amputations that ranged from minor to major, from single finger to entire limb, that totaled 14,000 to 20,000. Over winter, the surgery was brutal, was primitive, was conducted under terrible conditions in field hospitals that were cold, that were inadequate, that lacked proper equipment, proper supplies, proper everything. The surgeons who performed amputations daily, constantly, who saw frozen tissue, black tissue, dead tissue, who had to remove, to cut off, to amputate, to save lives, who worked under stress, under pressure, under conditions. That made surgery difficult. That made success uncertain. That made everything harder. The operations that were performed without adequate anesthesia, often without proper pain control, without what was needed for humane surgery. The patients who suffered, who were in agony, who felt everything or too much, who screamed, who begged, who endured unimaginable pain. The surgery that was necessary, that saved lives. Sometimes that was brutal, always that was conducted under conditions that were primitive, that were inadequate, that were evidence of catastrophe. The soldiers who underwent amputation suffered terribly during surgery, after surgery, for lifetime. The loss of fingers made holding rifle Impossible made operating equipment. Difficult made soldier. Less capable, sometimes useless. For combat, the loss of toes. Made marching. Difficult made walking. Painful made soldier. Less mobile, less effective. As infantry, the loss of feet ended military service completely. Made soldier unable to march, to walk properly, to function. As infantrymen, the loss of hands ended everything. Made soldier completely disabled. For military service, for most civilian work, for normal life. The loss of arms, of legs, created. Permanent invalids, created. Men who were crippled for life, who were disabled forever, who had been healthy soldiers before winter, before cold, before frostbite, destroyed them, the suffering of amputees. That was permanent, that lasted. Lifetime, that was physical and psychological, that was product of winter, of cold, of inadequate preparation, that destroyed. 14,000 to 20,000. German soldiers, permanently. The deaths directly from cold, from frostbite, from hypothermia. Numbered 33,415, according to records. The soldiers who died from cold-related causes, not from combat, not from wounds, not from disease primarily, but from cold, from freezing, from hypothermia, from frostbite complications, from exposure to temperatures that human body cannot survive. The deaths that were direct result of cold, of temperature, of winter, of conditions that killed the 33,000 who froze to death, who died of hypothermia, who were killed by temperature of -40 degrees, the deaths that were documented, that were recorded, that were evidence of how deadly cold was, how effectively temperature killed, how catastrophic winter was. For German army, outside Moscow, the permanent casualties from frostbite numbered 66,571. The soldiers who were disabled permanently by cold injuries, by frostbite, by amputations, by damage that couldn't heal, that couldn't be reversed, that left them unfit for service forever. The permanent casualties who were removed from army strength permanently, who would never return to combat, who would never serve again, who were lost to Wehrmacht forever because of frostbite, because of cold, because of winter that damaged them irreparably, permanently, catastrophically. The 66,000 who were added to dead, added to temporarily disabled, added to 227,000 frostbite cases. Total, the permanent casualties. That showed long-term impact of winter, of cold, of frostbite epidemic. That destroyed German soldiers. Permanently, the German government created medal for service on Eastern Front during winter campaign. The Ostmedaille, the Eastern Front Medal, the East Medal, that was awarded to soldiers who served during winter of 1941 to 42, who survived, who endured, who experienced extreme cold, extreme suffering, extreme conditions. The medal, that was official recognition of service in catastrophic conditions. The medal, that soldiers called something different, called nickname, that was bitter, that was accurate, that was testimony to their suffering. The Gefrier Fleischorden, the order of frozen flesh, the badge of frozen meat, the nickname that showed what soldiers thought of winter campaign, of suffering endured, of cold that froze them, that damaged them, that killed them. The nickname that was bitter humor, that was accurate description, that was soldiers' own assessment of what happened to them in winter outside Moscow. The medal that was called Order of Frozen Flesh, that showed what winter did, that showed what cold caused, that showed what frostbite epidemic did to German army, that froze, that damaged, that destroyed hundreds of thousands of German soldiers in winter, that broke Wehrmacht forever. The supply situation was catastrophic from the beginning of extreme cold, was inadequate before December, became impossible after. The supplies that army needed desperately to function, to survive, to fight, weren't arriving, couldn't arrive, in quantities needed, in types required, in regularity necessary for army to survive, for soldiers to function, for operations to continue. The supply situation that had been challenging in autumn, that had been difficult in November, became catastrophic in December, when extreme cold hit, when temperatures dropped to -40, when everything became harder, became more difficult, became nearly impossible. The supply crisis that contributed to deaths, to suffering, to destruction of army, as much as combat, as much as cold. The hunger that set in, that weakened soldiers, that made them vulnerable, to cold, to disease, to death. The distance was a fundamental problem that couldn't be solved. 2,000 kilometers from Germany to front lines outside Moscow. The vast distance that supplies had to travel. Over roads that were inadequate. Over rail lines that were different gauge. Over terrain that was hostile. Through conditions that were terrible. The distance that made supply extraordinarily difficult, even under best conditions. That made logistics nearly impossible. Under winter conditions, under extreme cold, under circumstances that existed in December, in January, in February, the 2,000 kilometers that was simply too far for effective supply of large army, in combat, in winter, in Russia, the distance that doomed supply efforts from beginning, that made adequate supply nearly impossible, that contributed to starvation, to suffering, to death of thousands. The priorities were fundamentally wrong for survival, were based on offensive operations, on combat needs, on military necessities, not on survival needs, not on what soldiers required to live in extreme cold, the ammunition that was prioritized above food, above winter clothing, above medical supplies, the fuel that was prioritized for vehicles. That didn't work, that were frozen, that couldn't use fuel. The priorities that made sense for offensive operations, for combat, for advance, but that were catastrophic for survival, for endurance, for staying alive in extreme cold, without adequate food, without winter clothing, without what humans need to survive. Temperatures of -40, the priorities that valued military capability over soldier survival, that assumed combat effectiveness was more important than keeping soldiers alive. The priorities that were wrong, that contributed to starvation, to suffering, to death. The food supplies were inadequate from start of extreme cold, were insufficient for soldiers' needs in normal conditions, were catastrophically inadequate. In extreme cold, the human body in extreme cold requires enormous caloric intake to maintain body temperature, to generate heat, to survive. The soldiers in combat, in -40 temperatures, required 3,000 calories daily or more to maintain body temperature, to function, to survive. The rations that were arriving were a fraction of this, were perhaps 1,000 calories, perhaps less on many days, were starvation rations that couldn't sustain soldiers in extreme cold, that left them slowly starving while freezing, while trying to fight, while trying to survive. The inadequate food that was arriving in insufficient quantities, that was catastrophic failure of logistics, of planning, of everything. The soldiers were constantly hungry, were starving slowly, the hunger that was always present, that gnawed constantly, that weakened progressively. The soldiers who needed food to generate body heat, to survive cold, who weren't getting adequate nutrition, who were slowly starving, the hunger that combined with cold to create deadly combination that killed more effectively than either alone. The starving soldier who couldn't generate adequate body heat, who was more vulnerable to hypothermia, to frostbite, to cold-related death. The hunger that made cold deadlier, the cold that made hunger deadlier, the combination that killed thousands, that weakened everyone, that destroyed combat capability of entire army, the constant hunger that soldiers endured, that weakened them, that made survival less likely, that contributed to catastrophe. The horses were slaughtered systematically for food, were killed, were butchered, were eaten by starving soldiers, the horses that numbered thousands, that were transportation, that were artillery movers, that were mobility, were killed for food, for meat, for protein, for calories, for something to eat, for soldiers who were starving. The systematic slaughter that began in December, that continued through winter, that eliminated horses, that had been critical for transportation, for supply, for artillery movement, the sacrifice of future capability, for immediate survival, the slaughter of horses, that provided meat, that sustained soldiers, temporarily, that gave them something to eat, something with protein, something with calories, but that eliminated transportation capability, that destroyed mobility, that reduced army's capability to move, to supply itself, to function as military force. The horses that were eaten, that sustained soldiers for weeks, that delayed, worst of starvation, but that were finite resource, that were eventually gone, consumed, eaten, leaving soldiers with nothing but inadequate rations. From failed supply system, the horse meat was barely palatable, was tough, was difficult to cook properly, in field conditions, was sometimes eaten half raw, because fuel for cooking was scarce, because conditions made proper cooking nearly impossible. The horse meat that soldiers ate desperately, gratefully, because it was something, was calories, was protein, was better than starving. The meat that provided temporary relief from hunger, that sustained some soldiers, that kept some alive who would have starved without it. The systematic consumption of horses, that was evidence of desperation, of catastrophe, of army that was eating its own transportation, its own capability to survive immediate crisis. The horse meat that was eaten until horses were gone, were all consumed, were finished, leaving army without horses, without transportation, without horse meat, without anything but starvation rations. That weren't enough. The starvation weakened soldiers catastrophically, made them unable to function properly, unable to fight effectively, unable to survive cold. The human body needs calories to generate heat, to maintain body temperature, to survive extreme cold. The soldiers who weren't getting adequate calories, couldn't generate adequate heat, were losing body temperature, were becoming hypothermic, were dying from combination of starvation and cold. The weakened soldiers who couldn't march long distances, who couldn't carry heavy loads, who couldn't dig fortifications, who couldn't do physical work that soldiers must do, the weakness that was product of starvation, that reduced combat capability, that made soldiers less effective, less dangerous, less capable of fighting, of surviving, of functioning. The starvation weakness that was epidemic, that affected everyone, that reduced entire armies' capability dramatically. The starvation changed soldiers' appearance, made them gaunt, made them skeletal, made them look like walking corpses. The weight loss, that was rapid, that was severe, that was visible. The soldiers who lost 20 kilograms, 30 kilograms, who became thin, then gaunt, then skeletal. The faces that became hollow, sunken, skull-like. The bodies that showed ribs, spine, bones, through skin. The appearance that shocked. Those who saw them, that showed clearly what starvation did, what hunger caused, what inadequate food created. The soldiers who looked like concentration camp victims, who were barely alive, who were walking dead, who were starving, while freezing, while fighting, while trying to survive. The appearance, that was evidence of catastrophe, of inadequate supply, of systematic starvation, of soldiers who were being slowly killed by hunger, combined with cold. The psychological effects of hunger were profound, were devastating, were all-consuming. The hunger that dominated all thought, all conversation, all consciousness. The soldiers who talked about food constantly, who remembered meals from home, who described favorite dishes, who fantasized about eating, who dreamed of food, who were obsessed with hunger, with eating, with not being hungry. The psychological obsession that was product of extreme hunger, of starvation that consumed mental energy, that dominated consciousness. That was all they thought about. The obsession with food that showed how hunger destroyed not just bodies, but minds, how starvation consumed everything. The psychological toll of constant hunger that was as destructive as physical effects that broke spirits, that destroyed morale, that made soldiers think only of food, of eating, of survival, not of combat, not of duty, not of anything else. The deaths from starvation were numerous, were product of prolonged inadequate nutrition, combined with extreme cold. The soldiers who starved to death, who died from malnutrition, from body, consuming itself completely, from organs, shutting down, from systems, failing, from starvation, completing its work. The deaths that were slow, that were agonizing, that were watching oneself die, slowly, knowing death was coming. From hunger, from lack of food, from inadequate nutrition. The starvation deaths that numbered thousands, that were part of total casualties, that were product of failed logistics, of inadequate supply, of priorities that were wrong. The deaths that could have been prevented with adequate food, with proper supply, with correct priorities. But that occurred because supply failed, because food didn't arrive, because soldiers starved while fighting, while freezing, while trying to survive. The starvation that killed thousands, that weakened everyone, that contributed to destruction of German army outside Moscow. The supply situation never improved, only worsened as winter progressed, as cold intensified, as conditions became more difficult. The supplies that were inadequate in December were worse. In January were catastrophic. In February, the supply lines that were barely functioning in December were broken. In January were nearly non-existent. In February, the food that didn't arrive in December arrived even less. In January, barely arrived at all. In February, the progressive failure of supply system that paralleled progressive destruction of army. The supply failure that contributed to deaths, to suffering, to catastrophe. That was winter outside Moscow, the hunger that set in December, that worsened, in January, that killed, through February, that was part of catastrophe, that destroyed German army, that broke. Wehrmacht, that combined with cold, with frostbite, with combat, to create total catastrophe. That killed hundreds of thousands. That broke. Army, forever. The hunger, that was part of starvation. Winter, that broke. German Army. December 5th, 1941. Dawn. The Soviet counter-offensive began. General Georgy Zhukov launched massive attack against exhausted German forces outside Moscow, the counter-offensive that had been prepared. Secretly, carefully, methodically, that employed fresh divisions from Siberia, from Far East, that were equipped for winter, that had winter training, that had winter clothing, that had weapons, that functioned in cold, that had everything. German forces lacked the counter-offensive that struck. Army that was already defeated. By cold, by hunger, by winter, that hit. Soldiers who couldn't resist effectively, who were barely surviving, who were at end of endurance. The Soviet attack. That was devastating to German forces. That began. Long retreat. That showed that Wehrmacht could be defeated. That German army wasn't invincible. The Soviet forces were fresh, were rested, were prepared. The divisions that had been transferred from Siberian military districts, from defense against Japan, that were professional soldiers, experienced troops, winter-trained forces who knew how to fight in cold, how to survive in winter, how to operate in extreme temperatures. The Siberian divisions, that were elite troops, that were well-equipped, that were ready for winter warfare. The soldiers who wore white camouflage, who had felt boots, insulated uniforms, proper winter clothing, adequate protection against cold. The soldiers whose weapons functioned in -40, who had equipment designed for winter warfare, who were prepared for conditions that German forces couldn't survive. The fresh Soviet forces that had every advantage, overexhausted, frozen, starving German soldiers. The Soviet intelligence had provided critical information about Japanese intentions. The spy, Richard Sorg, in Tokyo, had informed Soviet command that Japan would not attack Soviet Union in 41, would instead attack south, toward Pacific, toward British and American possessions. The intelligence that allowed Soviet command to transfer Siberian divisions from eastern defense to defense of Moscow without fear of Japanese attack. The intelligence that made counteroffensive possible, that provided fresh troops, winter-capable troops, elite divisions for attack on German forces. The intelligence from Sorge that was critical to Soviet victory, that enabled transfer of forces, that made counteroffensive possible, successful, devastating. The Soviet attack was overwhelming in its intensity. The fresh divisions that struck along entire front, outside Moscow, that attacked exhausted German forces, that hit frozen soldiers who couldn't defend effectively, who couldn't resist strongly, who were already broken by winter. The attack that broke through German lines, that shattered defensive positions, that forced retreat, that pushed back German forces from Moscow, from closest approach, from Khimki, from positions where they could see. Kremlin spies were driven back 60 kilometers, 100 kilometers, 250 kilometers, in places were forced into retreat. That was catastrophic. That was disastrous. That was first major defeat of Wehrmacht in World War II. The German forces couldn't resist effectively, were too weak, too frozen, too starving to mount effective defense. The divisions that were depleted, that were shadows of former strength, that had frozen weapons, dead vehicles, no horses, starving soldiers, Frostbitten men couldn't fight effectively, couldn't maneuver properly, couldn't defend successfully against fresh, well-equipped, winter-capable Soviet forces, the German forces, that were defeated before combat began, by cold, by hunger, by winter, that couldn't resist. Soviet counteroffensive, that were pushed back, that were forced to retreat, that were defeated. The inability to resist, that was product of winter, of cold, of starvation, of exhaustion, of everything that had destroyed combat capability before Soviets even attacked. The retreat began immediately. The German forces were pushed back from Moscow, from closest approach, from gates of capital, were driven back across terrain they had captured, were forced to abandon positions, to give up ground, to retreat under pressure from Soviet attacks in extreme cold, without vehicles, without horses, without mobility. The retreat that was disaster, that was catastrophic, that left behind equipment, weapons, supplies, everything that couldn't be carried, that couldn't be moved. Because vehicles were frozen, because horses were dead, because soldiers were too weak to carry heavy loads. The retreat, that was abandonment of everything, just trying to escape, to survive, to avoid encirclement, destruction, annihilation. The retreat was conducted in extreme cold, in temperatures of -40, by soldiers who were exhausted, who were starving, who were frostbitten, who could barely walk. The march in retreat, that killed thousands from exhaustion, from cold, from collapse. The soldiers who fell during march, who couldn't continue, who were left, who died in snow. The retreat, that was march of death, that killed as effectively as combat, that destroyed units through attrition, through exhaustion, through cold, through everything. The retreat in winter, that was catastrophic, that killed thousands, that showed how completely winter had destroyed German armies' capability to operate, to move, to function as military force. The equipment was abandoned during retreat, the vehicles that couldn't move, the tanks that were frozen, the artillery that couldn't be pulled, the supplies that couldn't be carried, everything that was heavy, that required transport, that needed vehicles or horses to move, was left behind, was abandoned, was lost. The enormous losses of equipment, of weapons, of everything that Wehrmacht couldn't afford to lose. The abandoned equipment, that showed how completely mobility was lost, how thoroughly transportation failed, how catastrophically retreat destroyed German armies' material capability, the equipment left behind. In retreat, that was evidence of catastrophe, of defeat, of destruction. The casualties from Battle of Moscow were enormous. The German casualties totaled 250,000 to 400,000 dead or wounded. The enormous casualties that were product of combat, of retreat, of winter, of everything. The casualties that included combat deaths, frostbite deaths, starvation deaths, retreat deaths, everything that destroyed German army. Outside Moscow, the 250,000 to 400,000 that were added to 734,000 from previous 5 months. That brought total German casualties from Operation Barbarossa through Battle of Moscow to nearly million men, from 3.2 million who invaded, nearly million were casualties. By February, 42, the catastrophic losses that destroyed German army, that broke Wehrmacht, that ended myth of invincibility. The Soviet casualties were also enormous, were actually higher than German casualties. The Soviet losses from Battle of Moscow were 600,000 to 1.3 million dead, wounded, or captured. The enormous Soviet casualties. That exceeded German casualties significantly. But that didn't matter strategically, because Soviet Union could replace losses, could bring up fresh divisions, could sustain casualties that would destroy. Smaller nation, the Soviet losses that were terrible, that were catastrophic. For individuals, for families, for units, but that were sustainable. For Soviet Union, that had population of nearly 200 million, that had resources, that had space, that had capability to absorb casualties that would destroy. Germany, the Soviet casualties that were higher, but that were sustainable, while German casualties were unsustainable, were catastrophic, were destroying Wehrmacht's capability to continue war. The counteroffensive succeeded in its objectives, saved Moscow, drove back German forces, prevented capture of capital, achieved strategic victory, the success that was first major defeat of Wehrmacht in World War II. That ended myth of German invincibility, that showed that German army could be beaten, could be defeated, could be driven back. The counteroffensive. That was turning point, was beginning of German decline, was end of easy victories, was start of long retreat that would end. In Berlin, in 1945, the counteroffensive at Moscow. That was strategic victory. That was psychological victory. That was beginning of German defeat. That showed that winter was deadliest weapon that Soviet Union possessed. That cold could defeat Wehrmacht. That nature was ultimate ally of Soviet defense. The counteroffensive struck army that was already broken. By winter, the Soviet forces that attacked didn't defeat. Healthy army didn't overcome. Strong force didn't beat. Capable opponent attacked army that was already defeated. By cold, by hunger, by winter, that was barely functioning, that couldn't resist. Effectively, that was broken. Before combat began, the counteroffensive that just completed. What winter had begun, that pushed back. Army, that cold, had already defeated, that drove back. Forces, that starvation, had already weakened, that destroyed. Wehrmacht, that winter, had already broken. The counterattack, that began. German retreat, that started. Long defeat, that ended. German advance, that showed. That winter had broken. German army, that cold, had destroyed. Wehrmacht, that starvation winter, had defeated. German forces, outside Moscow. The counterattack, that was final blow. To army, that winter, had already broken. December 16th, 1941. Hitler issued order that would define German response to crisis, to retreat, to defeat. The order that was absolute, that was final, that permitted no exceptions, no withdrawals, no retreats. The order that said, stand fast, hold positions, dig in, don't yield, don't retreat an inch. The order. That was Hitler's response to Soviet counteroffensive, to German retreat, to crisis. That threatened to become rout, to become collapse, to become disaster. The famous order that became pattern, that would repeat throughout war, that would cost hundreds of thousands of German lives. Eventually, the order that started at Moscow in December 41. The order to stand fast. The order was response to crisis, to situation that was desperate. The German forces that were being pushed back by Soviet counteroffensive that were in danger of disorderly retreat, of rout, of complete collapse. The retreat that had begun, that was accelerating, that threatened to become disaster. The situation that Hitler saw from headquarters in East Prussia, far from front, that appeared to be catastrophe. The retreat that Hitler feared would become. Rout would become. Complete collapse would destroy German army completely. The fear, that retreat, would turn into what happened to Napoleon's army in 1812. The fear of total collapse, of complete destruction, of catastrophe. That drove Hitler's decision to issue stand-fast order, the order specifically stated that troops must dig nails into ground, must hold at all costs, must not retreat, must not withdraw, must defend where they were, regardless of circumstances, regardless of casualties, regardless of Soviet attacks, regardless of everything. The order, that was absolute. That permitted no tactical withdrawals, no local retreats, no pulling back to better positions, no consolidating defensive lines, nothing, just hold. Where you are, stand fast, don't move. The order, that was military straitjacket, that prevented commanders from responding to local situations, from making tactical decisions, from withdrawing when necessary. The order, that was Hitler's solution to crisis, that was prevention of tactical flexibility, that was recipe for catastrophe. The generals disagreed strongly with order, wanted to retreat, to consolidate lines, to establish defensive positions where holding was feasible, where supply was possible, where survival was likely. The generals, who understood that holding current positions was impossible, was suicidal, was death sentence for soldiers who were already dying from cold, from hunger, from conditions that made holding ground nearly impossible. The generals, who wanted strategic withdrawal, tactical retreat, consolidation of lines to positions that could be defended, that could be supplied, that could be held. The generals, who were overruled by Hitler, who ordered stand fast, who forbade retreat, who demanded holding current positions regardless. Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, Commander-in-Chief of German Army, resigned in protest, in ill health, in exhaustion, in despair. The resignation, that was also protest against Hitler's interference, against orders that were militarily unsound, against decision to forbid tactical retreat when retreat was necessary. The resignation that Hitler accepted gladly, that Hitler used to consolidate personal control of army. Hitler, who appointed himself commander-in-chief, who took direct command of army operations, who would, from this moment, command German army, personally, directly, catastrophically. The resignation of Brauchitsch, that gave Hitler direct control, that eliminated professional military command structure, that put dictator in direct command of military operations. That was disaster. General Heinz Guderian, best panzer commander in Wehrmacht, most successful tank general, most experienced armor leader, made tactical withdrawal, with 2nd Panzer Group pulled back short distance to better positions, to defensible lines, to positions where holding was feasible. The tactical withdrawal, that was militarily sound, that was necessary, that was what professional commander should do. That Hitler considered disobedience, considered violation of stand-fast order, considered intolerable. Hitler, who sacked Guderian, who removed best panzer commander for making tactical withdrawal, for doing what was militarily necessary, for saving his troops from worse situation. The sacking, that showed that Hitler was serious about stand-fast order, that disobedience would result in removal. The sacking of Guderian, that sent message to all generals, to all commanders: obey or be removed, hold positions or be sacked, stand fast or be dismissed. The stand-fast order did prevent total collapse in some areas, did maintain cohesion in some units, did preserve army organization to some extent, the alternative of disorderly retreat. Might have been worse, in some cases, might have led to complete rout, to total destruction, to catastrophe. Worse than what occurred. The stand-fast order. That forced soldiers to hold, that maintained. Some discipline, that prevented. Immediate disaster, of complete collapse, that kept. Some units, intact, that preserved. Some organization, the order, that had. Some justification, some military logic, in preventing, worst-case scenario, of total rout, of complete collapse, of destruction. Worse than what happened. But the cost was enormous, was catastrophic, was thousands of additional deaths. The soldiers, who were forced to hold exposed positions, who couldn't retreat, to better lines, who had to stay, where supply was impossible, where shelter was inadequate, where cold killed them, where hunger starved them, where conditions made survival nearly impossible. The soldiers who died because of stand-fast order, who froze in positions they couldn't leave, who starved where they couldn't be supplied, who died because retreat was forbidden. The cost of stand-fast order, that was thousands of lives, thousands of deaths that might have been prevented by tactical retreat, by withdrawal, to better positions, by pulling back to defensible lines, where supply was possible, where survival was likely. The stand-fast order became pattern, that repeated throughout war, became Hitler's standard response to any retreat, to any withdrawal, to any tactical pullback. The pattern that would result in enormous casualties, in destroyed armies, in catastrophes like Stalingrad, like later encirclements, like disasters. Throughout war, the pattern that started at Moscow in December 41, when Hitler ordered stand fast, when he forbade retreat, when he demanded holding ground regardless. The pattern that would kill hundreds of thousands of German soldiers over course of war, that would contribute to German defeat, that would destroy multiple armies, that began outside Moscow in winter of 41. The pattern of stand fast that started here, that would continue, that would destroy German army, piece by piece, division by division, campaign by campaign. The winter continued regardless of orders. The stand-fast order didn't stop. Cold didn't prevent. Starvation didn't reduce. Casualties. From winter, the soldiers who were ordered to stand fast still froze, still starved, still died. From cold, from hunger, from conditions. That order didn't change, didn't improve, didn't make survivable. The stand-fast order that maintained military position, somewhat, but that didn't. Stop dying, from winter, from cold, from starvation, that continued, through December, through January, through February, regardless of orders, regardless of Hitler's commands, regardless of everything. The winter, that continued, killing German soldiers by thousands, by tens of thousands, regardless of stand-fast order, that prevented retreat, but that didn't prevent death from cold, from hunger, from winter, that continued destroying German army outside Moscow. The order to stand fast, that was Hitler's solution, that prevented retreat, that caused additional deaths, that contributed to catastrophe, that was part of winter, that broke German army forever. January through February 1942. The winter continued. The suffering intensified, the dying accelerated, the catastrophe deepened. The months that were continuation of December horrors, but worse, colder, more deadly, more complete destruction. The winter that had begun, destroying army, in December, continued its work, in January, in February, until army was broken, completely, irreparably, forever. The winter that destroyed, not just soldiers, not just divisions, not just combat capability, but something more fundamental, more permanent, more complete. The winter that broke, spirit that destroyed, confidence that ended, myth of invincibility that showed that Wehrmacht could be defeated, could be broken, could be destroyed. By conditions, by weather, by nature. The winter that broke them. The cold remained extreme throughout January. The temperatures that stayed below -30, regularly, that reached -40, frequently. That were conditions that killed, constantly, remorselessly, efficiently. The January cold, that was coldest of entire winter, that was most severe period, that was most deadly time, that created most casualties, most suffering, most death. The cold in January, that was peak of winter catastrophe, that was worst, that army endured, that killed. More than December cold, that destroyed, more thoroughly than any other period. The cold that persisted through entire month, that didn't moderate, that didn't warm, that stayed, deadly, day after day, week after week, through January, through worst of winter, the cold that killed thousands. In January alone, the frostbite epidemic continued through January. The new cases that appeared daily, despite all precautions, despite improvised protection, despite desperate measures. The frostbite that was inevitable, in conditions of -40, with inadequate protection, with summer uniforms, with exposure that couldn't be avoided. The new cases that numbered thousands per week. In January, that added to already overwhelming numbers. That brought total toward 227,000. By end of winter, the frostbite that continued to overwhelm medical services, that continued to require amputations, that continued to disable soldiers, that continued to reduce combat capability of army day by day, soldier by soldier, unit by unit. The frostbite epidemic that persisted through January, through coldest month, through worst conditions, through most extreme temperatures. The amputations continued in field hospitals throughout January. The surgeons who performed operations constantly, daily, without rest, without adequate supplies, without adequate anything, the operations to remove frozen fingers, frozen toes, frozen feet, frozen hands, frozen arms, frozen legs, the amputations that were necessary to save lives, to prevent gangrene from spreading, to stop infection from killing, the operations that were performed under primitive conditions, in cold hospitals with inadequate anesthesia, with limited supplies, with everything working against success. The surgeons who worked to exhaustion, who performed hundreds of operations, who saved some lives, who couldn't save others, who witnessed suffering they couldn't prevent, who saw agony they couldn't eliminate, who did what they could with what they had, which wasn't enough, which was never enough. The amputations that continued through January, that numbered hundreds, perhaps thousands. In January alone, that disabled German soldiers permanently, that removed them from combat forever. The starvation worsened dramatically in January. The supply situation that had been catastrophic in December became even worse in January. The supplies that weren't arriving became even scarcer. The food that had been inadequate became nearly non-existent. The soldiers who had been hungry became starving, who lost more weight who became weaker, who approached limits of human endurance, the starvation in January. That was worse than December, that killed more soldiers, that weakened everyone, that made survival even less likely. The combination of extreme hunger and extreme cold, that was deadly, that killed, through synergy, through hunger, making soldiers vulnerable to cold, through cold, making hunger more deadly. The combination that killed thousands in January. The horses were mostly gone by January, had been slaughtered for food, had died from cold, had been lost to conditions. The horses that had numbered thousands in December were hundreds. In January were nearly gone by February. The loss of horses, that was catastrophic, for mobility, for supply, for artillery movement, for everything. The army, without horses, without vehicles, that worked, without any reliable transportation, was crippled completely, was unable to move, to supply itself, to position artillery, to function as military force. The loss of horses in January, that was additional catastrophe, additional blow, additional evidence of how completely winter destroyed every aspect of German military capability. The morale collapsed completely in January. The soldiers, who had maintained some hope, some belief, in December lost it. In January, the soldiers who understood, finally, completely, that they wouldn't win, wouldn't be rescued, wouldn't survive. Probably the realization that came in January, when hope died, when belief ended, when acceptance began of likely death, of probable defeat, of certain suffering. The morale that had been crumbling collapsed completely in January. The soldiers who stopped fighting for victory, started fighting for survival, who stopped believing in campaign, started believing only in getting through, next hour, next day, next week, if possible. The morale that collapsed, that showed in behavior, in performance, in everything. That army was broken psychologically as well as physically. The deaths accelerated in January. The casualties that had been high in December increased in January. The soldiers who died from cold, from hunger, from disease, from exhaustion, from everything. The deaths that numbered thousands per week in January. That brought total casualties from winter to enormous numbers. The deaths that were mostly from non-combat causes, from starvation, from cold, from disease, from conditions, not from Soviet action, not from combat, not from enemy fire, but from winter, from weather, from conditions that killed more effectively than combat. The deaths in January that were peak of winter dying, that showed how deadly winter was, how catastrophic conditions were, how completely nature was destroying German army. The February retreat continued. The German forces that had been pushed back in December continued retreating in January. In February, the withdrawal that was systematic, that was forced by Soviet pressure, by inability to hold, by weakness, that was product of winter. The retreat that continued through February, that pulled back German forces farther from Moscow, that abandoned more territory, that gave up more ground. The retreat that showed that army was defeated, that Wehrmacht was broken, that German forces couldn't hold, couldn't resist, couldn't function as effective military force. The retreat that continued through February, that was evidence of defeat, of catastrophe, of broken army. The winter of 1941 to 42 broke German army in ways that were permanent, that couldn't be repaired, that lasted through rest of war. The army that had seemed invincible was shown to be. Vulnerable. The Wehrmacht that had conquered most of Europe was defeated. By winter, the soldiers, who had believed in victory, lost belief, lost confidence, lost certainty. The winter, that broke. Not just bodies, not just units, but spirit, confidence, belief in invincibility. The winter, that showed that German army could be beaten, could be defeated, could be broken by conditions, by weather, by nature. The psychological break, that was permanent, that lasted, that affected German army. Through rest of war, the winter, that broke them, that destroyed. Confidence, that ended. Myth of invincibility, that created. Doubt, that persisted. The winter of 1941 to 42, that broke German army in ways that were permanent, irreparable, complete. The winter that broke them forever. The ruins of the German advance outside Moscow stand now as memory, as history, as evidence of what occurred there. The frozen ground where hundreds of thousands suffered, where tens of thousands died, where German army was broken. By winter, by cold, by conditions that no preparation could overcome. The winter of 1941 to 42 that changed the war, that ended German invincibility, that began long defeat that would end in Berlin. In 1945, the German Sixth Army would face winter again at Stalingrad. In 1942 to 43, would be destroyed again by cold, by hunger, by encirclement. The pattern that began outside Moscow would repeat, would destroy another army, would kill hundreds of thousands more. The winter warfare that Germany never mastered. That defeated Wehrmacht repeatedly, that contributed to final German defeat. The lessons learned outside Moscow were paid for in blood, in suffering, in hundreds of thousands of casualties. The lessons about winter warfare, about preparation, about logistics, about respecting nature, about understanding that some enemies cannot be defeated by force alone. The lessons that came too late to save those who learned them, that cost too much in German lives, that showed what happens when army meets winter unprepared. The myth of invincibility died outside Moscow. The belief that Wehrmacht could not be defeated, that German army always won, that victory was inevitable, died in snow outside Soviet capital, was buried in frozen ground where German soldiers fell, was extinguished by cold that killed more surely than bullets. The myth that had sustained Germany through early victories was destroyed by reality of Russian winters, by defeat at Moscow, by starvation, winter that broke German army. The starvation, winter of 1941 to 42, broke German army in ways that were permanent, that couldn't be repaired, that lasted through rest of war. The army that had seemed unstoppable was stopped, was defeated, was broken, by cold, by hunger, by winter, by conditions, by nature. The Wehrmacht that had conquered Europe was destroyed outside Moscow, not primarily by Red Army, not primarily by combat, but by winter, by temperature, by starvation, by cold that killed hundreds of thousands. Rest now. The story is told. The numbers are clear, the arithmetic is complete, the catastrophe is documented. The starvation winter that broke German army is told, is recorded, is remembered. The 3.2 million who invaded, the nearly million who were casualties by spring, the 227,000 who suffered frostbite, the 33,000 who froze to death, the 14,000 who required amputations, are remembered, are documented, are told. Their story, their suffering, their dying, their catastrophe is preserved here. The starvation winter of 1941 to 42, outside Moscow, when German army froze, when Wehrmacht starved, when soldiers died by hundreds of thousands, when winter broke them forever. The story that is told, that is complete, that is finished. Rest now.